Stanford called me and they said, look, we have one of the biggest issues right now during COVID, this is like a year into it or 6 months into it. They said is that suicides are going through the roof. Depression is through the roof. People are overdosing through the roof. And we had 2 of our professors come through your Date with Destiny seminar, the 6-day seminar I have, and they said they both were clinically depressed and they're both off all their medication. There's no depression in them. And they said, we never think like this. And we'd like to know, do you have some studies? And I said, well, I give you 1 million testimonials or more. But he said, no, I mean, like, I said, no, but if you want to do a study, I'd be open to it. So they said, I said, what do you want to study? They said, how effective you'd be in wiping out depression without drugs or therapy. I said, fantastic. I said, tell me what the standard is. Like, what do the meta studies show? Because I've read a lot of them over the years. And they said, well, Tony, 60% of the people who are depressed and go in for, psychiatric help, meaning they get drugs, Zoloft, Prozac or whatever, and or therapy, 60% make 0 improvement. 40% improve on average, but their average improvement is 50%. So they're still half as depressed. Most people are on the drugs forever. Few people get well, but very few. I said, well, you can almost get that result with a placebo. And he kind of laughed nervously and said, well, yeah, that's probably true. And I said, well, we'll beat that, but what's the best result you've ever gotten? And he said, well, there was a study done 5 years ago at Johns Hopkins University where they gave people a month of psilocybin and cognitive therapy every day for a month. And he said, the results were, I said, they better be incredible. You change people's brains, right? I said, what happened? He goes, best results in the history of psychiatry, 53% of the people 6 weeks later had no symptoms. I said, all right, we have our target. We want to beat that. I said, it sounds like hubris, but I'm willing to bet you a large sum of money will wipe that out. Because I've had so much life experience. I've done this forever. We have a night at the event called Suicide Night, because when you have 5,000 people, there's at least a dozen that are suicidal in any group. And I go one after another and wipe them out. And then we follow up on them 3 years later, 5 years later, so people see it last. So I said, I'm pretty confident, but I said, let's just see it. You set up the study. So they copied the study as Johns Hopkins. They had the same contrast group, everything else. At the end of 6 days, no therapy, no drugs, right? 6 weeks later is when they do the follow-up. 93% of the people had 0 depression. The 7% that had it had improved about 80%, but not completely. And then 17% went in with suicidal ideation, meaning considering suicide.